Mormon Mental Health Podcast is a production of the Open Stories Foundation and relies on donations from its listeners like you. To help keep this podcast alive, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber. Any amount will make a difference. You can click the right-hand donate button on mormonmentalhealth.org. All contributions are tax-deductible within the United States and go towards podcast production and building community support and program development for Mormons on various paths and journeys. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jeff Lundgren, and I'll be hosting today's episode. We have a wonderful guest I've lined up for us. I'm very excited to interview her. But before we get started, I'd like to thank Natasha Helfer-Parker for opening this opportunity for me to participate as a host on this podcast and give back to our community. A couple of things to mention. First, Mormon Mental Health Podcast is sustained only through your donations, and it costs, frankly, around $5,000 per year just to barely cover the cost. So any donation that you can make, whether that's a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, if that's helpful for you, would be greatly appreciated. And you can do that at mormonmentalhealth.org. If you would just prefer to support in non-financial ways, you can do that by liking our Facebook page, sharing links, telling a friend, that kind of thing, even participating by providing some comments or notifying us about topics that you would be interested in. Lastly, just to introduce myself, I'm a practicing therapist in the Salt Lake City area. I work primarily with individuals who are struggling with a lot of common mental health challenges, and I work a lot and probably primarily with those from a Mormon background because these topics tend to intersect from our cultural experiences, and that's what I do. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Jenny Black. Welcome to Mormon Mental Health Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So Jenny is a stay-at-home mom. She does just about everything else. In fact, she runs a blog called Everything.
Be Everything.
Oh, Be Everything Housing. Thank you.
Be EverythingHousewife.com.
Thank you. She's an author. She likes to blog. She's very much into crafts. She produces a lot of amazing stuff. And she's been through her own Mormon journey, and she'll probably tell you a lot about her story. So, which I want to even hear more. I don't think I know everything. Anyway, Jenny, welcome. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I am a stay-at-home mom of 3 little girls. My husband travels for a living, and because he travels, that has allowed me to pursue some of my own creative interests. So I would say that my website is an outlet for me. If you were to visit my website, I'm a very creative-minded individual, and I'm also a do-it-yourselfer. So pretty much everything I do, I am self-taught at it. I sew, I have recipes, but something also that's a unique feature and interest that I have is I study a lot of ancient symbolism, religious symbolism. I love history. I'm currently writing a series right now on the history of Halloween. My first article was just posted on the Salem witch trials. And if you were to read it, one thing you'll observe is that I like to observe how things happen, thought processes of individuals and how they get to a place where things happen in communities. And I like to observe why I think a certain way. And so anyway, I've written a couple series. I have a nativity series, and a lot of these things that I've chosen to pursue, I have this personal interest, and it is directly tied to my own spiritual journey that I've been on within my own community.
Wonderful. Thanks for that brief overview. So you were born in the church, I take it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about.
Born and raised. So my background, I was born in St. George, Utah, but I did not live in Utah very much as a child. I haven't had that Utah community experience. I actually lived in the South. And so my experience as an LDS individual in the South, growing up anyway, I don't know if it's the same now, but LDS people, Mormons, were not received well in the religious community. We were not viewed as Christians. However, my personal experience interacting with my friends from other faiths, they never saw me that way. But religious teachers in those community, definitely my experience was that we were not welcome, and they, and I think things have changed dramatically. That was definitely in my younger years. I remember that stigma anyway.
Okay, so then you grew up in the South.
Yes, yeah. Let me let me continue that. So then, lived in the South. I lived in Colorado briefly for a time, and I have just moved back to my roots. And when I say my roots, I descend from a long line of pioneers. And so I am back in my community in southern Utah here, and everywhere I go in town are my pioneer roots. I'm related to somebody who built something, who established something. Even in my backyard, if you were to walk in my backyard, I have one of the beehives that used to sit around the wall of the St. George Temple that my great-grandfather cast to build the temple. And if you go down to the tabernacle, there were letters that my other great-grandfather on my other side put inside time capsules that were found inside of the tabernacle. And so my pioneer ancestry and heritage, it's incredibly rich. And I have an immense, everywhere I go in town, I'm related to somebody too. So it's a very different experience for me to be here in Utah, but I also feel extremely connected to my roots here.
Yeah, you've had a very diverse upbringing just from the places that you've lived.
Yes.
So as you were raised in the church, your parents were members. What types of experiences did you have that you found helpful for you, and maybe some things that were difficult when you were younger?
Ooh, to be completely honest, my experience in my youth, I don't want to say that I had this. My parents were active. We attended church. I don't want to say that we were picture perfect LDS. We attended church every week, and my dad was a seminary teacher. We were faithful attendees, and definitely, we lived right by our church, so we were part of the community. But I don't want to say that that my family, there's what's the stereotype of your Molly Mormons and your Peter priesthoods. I don't want to say that was my family. And privately behind the scenes, there was definitely, my parents in their marriage, there was definitely a lot of, dysfunction that you may have seen, outwardly, in interactions, but I don't want to say that my family had, we were LDS, but I don't know that. I spent a lot, like I said, I had a lot of friends that I personally associated with outside of the church, which was pretty normal growing up in the South. Your LDS community was pretty small. And so our friends were in and outside of the church. So my experience, Mormonism wasn't, it's not like, I don't know, Mormonism, it becomes your identity. It becomes your identity as you're in the community. But I don't want to say that in our home, we were just a normal family who went to church and did the best we could with what we had. I don't think anybody would describe us, our family, as someone that were, strict, straight-laced Mormons that never, that never had any issues or anything like that. So
Yeah. And you grew up as a teenager, when you went to school, maybe some of your early experience as a young adult. How did your Mormon experience challenge you?
Okay.
Tell us a little bit more about that journey.
So for me personally, throughout my whole life, I have been described as a goody two shoes. That is my persona. That's not necessarily, my family's persona or even necessarily my siblings, but my persona has always been, oh, Jenny's a goody two shoes. Jenny's a rule follower. Jenny's obedient. I was that kid in my family. So I think, with the Mormon persona, I fit in well to that, like we've got this squeaky clean, everything, is great. Anyway, this is my perception. Mormonism, in my eyes, you look at it and it's these beautiful communities, beautiful families, everything's, beautiful. And, but that can be hard when everything's not beautiful always internally. So, but for me, being a goody and being a rule follower, that's always been my thing. I still think I'm a rule follower. I just follow different rules now.
Yeah. And I think from a mental health perspective, it's Mormonism, we typically classify as a high demand religion. And it does have both. I think there's a benefit in that type of structure, works for a lot of people. And then sometimes the message that we receive around being that strict rule follower doesn't always work.
Absolutely. Actually, to just add to that, as I have, and I call what I've gone through, I consider myself to be progressing, even though others might see my new rule box as something that's maybe not as kosher. I'm still once you get, I'm describing myself on an external level, what people might be observing on an external level. You meet me, I'm one of the nicest people. I'm harmless. I'm happy. I'm constantly, I still serve in my community. I still go to church every Sunday. I just think differently and my priorities have changed, and I've given myself permission to allow myself to change my priorities. And that was the hardest thing for me. You're taught that these are your priorities, and giving myself permission to change those priorities for actually what fit my family best. That's where I am now, so I totally agree with that. And, the rule box that I live with, I still, my moral compass, is immensely strong. I just, there's some cultural things that I just now, and I think everybody does it, but for someone who's really straight-laced and really good at following rules, it's really hard for them to say, okay, I'm going to let my hair down on some of these rules.
So I would imagine that some of our listeners are saying, oh my goodness, like I want to be like Jenny. I want to feel that empowerment within myself to choose things that I find are helpful for me and not struggle with the tension between how I identify with myself and what appeals to me, physically, spiritually, emotionally. How did you go from where you were at whatever point that was to where you're at today? Can you give us some examples?
Yes. So it actually started with the church essays. I had a family member who had left the church after reading these church essays, and I was being relayed information that they were reading about. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, they are reading apostate material. That is apostate material. I have researched these topics on approved sites. That's apostate material. And that was my judgment. And I stuck with it until I get really sick during my pregnancies, and it causes me, it's probably the only time that I'm not up and about doing something. I'm a really busy person, and I choose to be busy. I like being busy, which probably gives you a little idea of what my cultural stance and how I was actively involved in church. Everything revolved in my home around church-centered activities. And so after, this is not a bad thing, but if I'm, as my rule box has changed, I've changed, activities, it's just not quite so focused on some of these cultural activities that we think, we've got to do in Mormonism, or at least I thought I had to. At least I thought I did. So anyway, so I am sick, I'm ill, I sit down, I say, well, I can't really do anything but read, because all I can do is lay on a couch. I think maybe I should look into this, and I'll see if I can help my family member that's left the church. So I sit down and I start reading through one of the essays. And of course, instantly, the essay topic that I decided I was going to tackle was the most difficult one for me internally. I've never had happy thoughts about plural marriage. That's not a subject that I ever, in all my church going years, just was like, oh, that's so beautiful. I picked the messiest subject, and I said, I'll tackle this topic first, and then I'll help my sister. And I get about halfway through the essay, and not only have I never even heard of stuff in the essay, but I came to a particular place, a particular way that the language was worded in the essay that made me uncomfortable. And so just to give you a little bit of background, I think this is God totally saying, oh, I know exactly what to put in front of Jenny. I know exactly what I can do to shake her up, because prior to that, one of my hobbies, and I don't know if it's a hobby, it's one of my interests. I studied, I love studying manipulative language and personalities and psychology. I loved reading self-help books. It was just my thing. And so before, and this was back when, now you hear, you'll get on the internet and you hear all the time about gaslighting and language manipulation in politics. But, I had been studying it for years, and I just never had any background information on anything that I had ever read on church history. I'd never studied church history on my own. So it was in particular, it was the way the language was worded in a few sentences within that particular essay that made me so uncomfortable. It was an exact moment. It was an exact moment for me where I said, I no longer trust whoever is giving me this information. And it was an instantaneous moment where I said, I am having a crisis. I thought I knew everything that I knew. And then I said, not only don't know what I thought I knew, but I am having a crisis in this moment. Where do I turn for information? Because this does not sit well with me.
And I can imagine that type of an experience may have been challenging for you for a variety of reasons, but how does that experience impact a woman who may have struggled with some of her own things? What would that do to somebody?
Okay, well, as a woman, I can tell you how I've processed this now. For me, it's, we depend heavily on information to be distributed to us. And through the church, we have, and this is not a pattern. This pattern's always existed in religious communities. You depend on the information to be taught and interpreted to you. That is a biblical pattern. That is a scriptural pattern. There's nothing unnatural about it. However, you have to understand, for me personally, was always doing daily scripture study. I wasn't just doing daily scripture study. I was doing family scripture study with my family. I had already, in my level, I read the Old Testament, as a 16-year-old in my seminary class. It was a goal of mine to just tackle it on my own. Out of obedience, I had always been reading and processing the information that was given to me. Now, I will tell you, until I went on my own faith journey, I didn't understand it. I did not understand huge passages of scripture. I had to stick commentary notes, and every single thing that I read, I had to read somebody else's interpretation of it. To have some of the religious experiences that I've had as I've dared to venture into my own personal wilderness and process some of this information, I really, truly have seen the hand of God in my life delivering me and helping me through this process. And so huge passages of scripture unfolded to me during these experiences. And so as much as I saw, as much as I look back in this process as painful, it's been beautiful for me. It's also given me confidence as a woman. And this is a place that I'm trying to be more open in my speech about, on my blog, and especially, even, doing this podcast. I want to be more expressive as a woman about my love for the scriptures. I absolutely love the scriptures. I would love to have more opportunities to teach on the scriptures, and in a community where, it's not that we have we have the Relief Society and we have different things, but it's, for me, you really, at church on Sunday, you really are getting surface level of the gospel, absolutely surface level. I kind of write about this in one of the articles on my blog, where I talk about, as a teenager, the first time I read the Song of Solomon. And I just thought it was a total abomination to read the Song of Solomon as a teenager. Now I look at it in the context of, the beautiful language exchange between a man and a woman. And you're not going to get that depth at all in the short period of time on Sunday. So I definitely can see how, the best thing for me as a woman, the best language I can come up with to describe this is it's the difference between Martha and Mary. Martha is constantly serving at the table, but guess what? Mary's the one worshiping at his feet. And I want to be Mary. I want to be that type of individual who receives that knowledge for myself directly from the Savior himself. I don't want to spend my time serving at the table where others give that information to me. It's been quite healing for me to go on this journey on my own and come to my own conclusions about my own relationship with God, instead of having someone else tell me what that relationship should look like.
And did you find that process in internalizing your own spiritual journey was easy for you?
Oh, no. Oh, my goodness, no. This was one of the hardest, if not, actually, when I had that moment, when I was reading that essay, I will tell you, I went through some of the darkest places I have ever been through. I've never had what I would call, now I'll tell another story, because I ended up having my first set of panic attacks, and I'll venture into that. But I'm always a really productive individual who I enjoy doing stuff. I enjoy learning stuff and, checking off my checklist. I'm going to do this, this, and this today. And to be in a place where I did not know what I was supposed to be doing. And I made a deliberate decision. Okay. So when I read that essay, I have, other people will read the essays and, they'll say, not a big deal. I'm not worried about it. It'll all get figured out, Well, you didn't come from the same family environment I came from. I was immensely concerned about the welfare of my eternal family, not just in my personal relationship with my spouse. My spouse and I haven't always had, a hunky-dory relationship. And I would also say the same thing about my family, I talked about the dysfunction in my family growing up. I was the only remaining child in the church. And that was a huge, I mean, I can't even tell you the mental burden that you carry culturally, because you're supposed to be the strength of the family. You know, you're supposed to be the one that keeps the eternal family together. And, you know, and there's definitely a stigma about, you know, when people leave the church, what does that mean for my eternal exalted family? And, you know, some of those cultural, you know, labels that we place on families that are not all active, I absolutely just think are ridiculous now that I've gone through my own faith journey. And it's been of great peace to me to come to those conclusions. But I will tell you, it came at a great price. Those were incredibly dark moments of hopelessness, not knowing. I mean, in an instant, I didn't know what I believed. I did not know what I believed. And I chose, and when I say I chose, I don't want to mentally compartmentalize my journey in the sense that I want it to be real. I want my journey to be real and authentic. And if I have made an error in my understanding, I certainly want to know, and I want to fix it. You know, I want to fix it. So anyway, I want it to be real. And that's why I didn't dismiss that moment that I had. I think God was gearing me up for that moment. He said, you've studied language. You've studied all these things. Now I'm going to give you something that's going to make you uncomfortable. What are you going to do with this information? You know?
That's incredible. And I think your story is a really powerful example for women and men, frankly, to reach out, and if they need or want a spiritual involvement from or with the divine, that they can do that even when they transverse through this struggle that is not uncommon, similar to what you experienced.
Yeah. So when you're mentioning about the divine and feeling the divine hand of God, that is actually what saved me. And all I'll tell you is that during this time, the only thing I had, what it was, I did try to research this information. I did try to figure out what was true and what was not true. And I very quickly realized that, and I'm trying to say this gently, but sifting through church history is messed up. The records are messed up. And I'm saying that as gently as I possibly can, because there are so many different interpretations. There's so many different journal entries. You start going through the journal entries, and one journal entry will contradict another. You will find that, you know, I started reading through, honestly, I went back to her. I'm like, well, let's go to the Bible. Let's see what the Bible says, and let me compare their doctrinal teachings. Let me see if they've got sound doctrinal teachings. Who can I trust? Who can I not trust? And it really gets messy. And the thing that saved me, or that led me through this period of time, because I did need to know the answers. I absolutely did need to know the answers, was that I began to see the divine hand of God. And I actually write about this in one of my blog posts. My blog was completely, at that time, I was devoting it to crafting and recipes. And out of nowhere, I bust out with this article about the tree of life. And I start, my experience is the way that God started speaking to me was through prayer. I became very aware of the voice of God. And I put voice of God in quotations, because some people hear a voice and some people become aware of his presence. And I want to say, you know, we talk about signs follow the believers. I had very distinct answers through outward signs during that time, which is the only reason I got on a divine path. I'm telling you, sifting through that information is a very dark journey if you don't have someone leading you. My suggestion would be to find God. Find out how he speaks to you. And I didn't even know how he spoke to me. In fact, to be honest, I could not discern the difference between his voice and my emotions all that time and all my obedience and all my faithfulness, I now realize that there were times that I was dismissing the Spirit because I had to follow the rule book. I would receive counsel from leadership in different certain situations, and they're just people too. But it would directly contradict. I now see things that the Spirit was telling me, hey, Jenny, that's not going to work for your life or your family. If you do it, it's not going to help you. And I knew that. I remember having a really direct conversation with the bishop. I said to him, he gave me counsel that he thought would help me with something. And I looked at him and I said, I do not, because I was feeling a very strong prompting at the time. I said, I do not believe what you're telling me to do will work. And I said that because I'd done it 1,000 times. I'd already tried that. It wasn't going to work. I said, I do not believe what you're telling me to do will work. However, I will do what you tell me to do because you have discernment over me. So the lens that I saw through at that time during the gospel was I had stewards over me, and that they knew better anyway at that time than I did. And at that time, I did not know or understand how to hear the voice of the Spirit. And so you can interpret that however you want to. But I do very directly, I've spent a lot of time filtering through how that voice speaks to me. And I use the scriptures to do it. I don't apply my own interpretations. I spend a great deal of time garnering meaning from the scriptures and applying it to these things that I'm about to act on, because faith is an action. You're going to have to act. You can't just sit there and waffle back and forth between what you think you believe and what you don't. No, you're going to have to at some point act. Mm-hmm. And those moments when I would act in faith and when I would act righteously, and I didn't know if I was acting righteously or not. I was lost in the wilderness, but I would see the divine hand of God, and I'm saying that symbolically, the divine hand of God would appear. And that is how I made it through this journey. So
that's incredible. I'm curious because I know that you enjoy studying a lot about religious symbolism, different faith traditions, and not everybody that I would say not everybody that is actively involved at church, right, in our LDS tradition necessarily has the same beliefs, but especially as people go through a faith crisis or a faith journey like you have, they'll end up in different places. They don't necessarily even believe, in a divine creator in the same way. So what have you found out, or what have you experienced with maybe other people, family members, friends, and what has worked for other people that might be different from what you've experienced?
Okay. So I have talked to a lot of people in and outside of our faith, a lot of people who've been having what would be called a faith crisis. I've talked to some of those that we like to label as angry anti-Mormons. I've talked to a lot of those people, and I don't think they're angry, or they're not. Their anger, I think, if we could take the time to give them answers that are valid, and there's a lot of, and I experience this as well. There's a tendency to dismiss people who are angry as just angry people who want to destroy things. Well, people are angry because nobody hears what they're asking and they can't get any answers. I've been angry too, and you give some person some scriptural meat, and hopefully that can that calms a portion of the anger. But I will tell you that for me, talking with people, I actually, when I share my spiritual witnesses with people outside of my faith, I am very warmly received outside of my faith by people of other religious communities. I talk very much about being saved by grace. I had a very tangible witness through prayer where I was covered in his grace. I knew I was not saved by works, and all my obedience, I could not save myself. I needed a redeemer, and I talk about it, and the language that I use is very common. Even though I'm LDS, I can very much have this conversation with someone outside of my faith and, in the Bible Belt communities where we're speaking the same language. It's the exact same language. We're saying the same thing to one another. Mm-hmm. I will say, I do share my spiritual experiences with people in my community, and I have also written about them online, but it will go one of two ways. I have and to me, sharing your spiritual witnesses is one of the most effective ways to share knowledge of the divine, especially for people who have lost faith in God. That's the only way to reconnect those individuals, to say, well, I don't know why you haven't had that experience with God, but let me tell you what happened to me. Let me tell you what happened to me when I prayed. Because I did go through a period where I said, after I looked at our church records, then I started going backwards. I said, well, I'm going to look at the New Testament and the Old Testament. Well, guess what? The records get messier. You realize that they've been translated multiple times, and then you start studying ancient cultures, and there's a path that I will say people who venture into atheism take, and I have experimented on that thought. I said, have I made this stuff up in my head? If I had not had the witnesses through prayer that I had obtained, I can see how easy it would, through knowledge. It's like partaking of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I can see how just partaking of knowledge will take you to a direct path of atheism. Because there's a common thread that runs through all ancient cultures. They're actually worshiping very much in the same style, how they commune with spiritual forces. It's actually a common thread. They're all speaking different languages. They're all using different cultural customs, but it is a common thread of worship. And so, from an atheist perspective, that common thread is, they all just copied each other. One group copied another group, and they used it to control other people. Well, guess what? There are people who are controlling people with religion. Absolutely, that happens. And so I can see why the spiritual side of religion, the spiritual true worship patterns of having a relationship with God would be dismissed. And so I very directly, with certain individuals, I share with people, I prayed and this happened. And then I prayed again and this happened. And I didn't know the answer to this, and then this happened. And I've had during my journey through the wilderness, I had so many instances where I personally said, holy cow, I just won the lottery again and again and again, that I could not even describe those instances as mere coincidence. How I couldn't even explain how it would even be possible for those things to be coincidental. It was just too many.
And I think it's important to mention, not everybody has the same spiritual experience in Mormonism. And
yes.
And some of our listeners will say, for me, I don't know what I believe about God, or even if there's a God or goddess, or what does that even mean? And I think it's important to honor that, because what is working for them in a spiritual way, even if it tends to be rather agnostic, I think it's my belief that is exactly the experience that they need as a part of their development, or as a part of their experience.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. Everybody needs their space. I mean, if you were to come into my sphere and tell me, no, Jenny, you didn't have this experience, or you're supposed to be having this one, I would kick you out of my space. And so I don't mean that. I actually wouldn't. I actually wouldn't kick you out of my space, but I tell myself, my mental space, I'm in control of my mental space. I no longer allow, and I don't want to say, because I give myself permission to expand my mental space and close off my mental space for what has worked for me and what my actual experiences teach me. And so I choose not to get in debates, and I can have very calm conversations with people who believe the opposite. But oh my gosh, when people are going through this wilderness journey of what they do and what they don't, there is a lot of tension that can fester. And I think what I am learning and what I have learned is that we could foster better communication so that everybody can, as our church teaches, so that we can all worship according to the dictates of our own conscience.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's really important.
Yeah. So give us some tips maybe from your lived experience. What types of things would you recommend to other people who are experiencing depression, anxiety, or any number of struggles as a part of their Mormon experience? What are some things that you might suggest that would be helpful for them?
First of all, give yourself permission to not believe those things and to go on a journey and discover what you actually believe. And so there were cultural teachings that I very much had embraced, but on my journey, it's kind of like there's some scriptural language where it says it's the blind leading the blind into the ditch. Sometimes we will take a cultural teaching that really didn't work for us, and we'll teach it to our children. And then they'll teach it to their children. And we'll say, oh, you're just supposed to keep doing this. And I gave myself permission. I don't want to go against God. That's the first thing everyone needs to know is I said, if you can teach me through your lens, God. And so I gave myself permission to go on a journey. And through the scriptures, what is the scriptural teaching of this subject? What did they teach in church history on this subject? And I will tell you, you're going to find a lot of contradicting stuff in church history. You're going to find it one way and then another. You're also going to find Old Testament patterns and then the exact opposite occurring in the New Testament. And there's this whole thing where Christ comes and starts fulfilling things. I don't know that we talk about what that means as much, and what it means to have a Redeemer and to receive grace, because grace is something that is freely given, but you're the one who has to receive it. And that's and not as an excuse to sin, but as an excuse to allow him to clean you, to lift the burdens, to be relieved of chains and bondage. The New Testament saints are they, especially the apostle Paul, he says, am I not free? Why does he say that? What is he referring to? And so I, as I've, studied these things, and, the advice I would give is you don't have to apply what someone else is teaching you, just like a convert to the church gets the opportunity to process information and say, maybe I believe this, maybe I don't. Maybe, we give a lot of flexibility as we allow converts into the church. Do we give flexibility to people that have an eye-opening experience? Hey, maybe I don't believe all these things that I was taught, for the last, 30 some odd years of my life. And we have to recognize also that people that are teaching are just people, and they are teaching through the lens that they see through, as well as their own experiences and maybe what they were taught. But give yourself permission to go out and do a little research and say, I have a different perspective on this, and that's okay. That's okay. It doesn't mean I'm going against God because I disagree with your perception on this teaching.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. I know that our listeners will connect with your story a bit. And they'll be able to gather something that's meaningful for them. I know from our friendship, I've been able to learn from you, and I think
same, ditto.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So tell, how do people get a hold of you if they want to connect with you?
So I will tell you, my email is a disaster. I get lots of junk emails. However, I have a Facebook page where and an Instagram, and I'm starting to speak out loud. I've come to a place where I want to talk and share my own journey. And so, anyway, I have an Instagram and also a Facebook page, and I do my best as a busy mom to reply. So, that is the best way to reach me is through an Instagram or Facebook page. And I think it's great to ask questions out loud. So, rather than send me a private message, comment and let's, have an open discussion and get a lot of different ideas going, because that's how you grow.
Thank you. I am very appreciative of the time that you gave today. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And we wish you the best on your journey. Hopefully we can hear a little bit more from you down the road.
I would love to. Thank you for having me.
Thanks. Thanks, Jenny Black. Really appreciate your time. Again, if you'd like to donate to this podcast, that would be very appreciative. It is not inexpensive to pay for server, bandwidth, all those types of things. You can visit the website at mormonmentalhealth.org. Again, we have a Facebook page as well by the same name, not the org part, of course. And would love to get some feedback and comments from our listeners. If you would like to be a guest on this podcast, or you have topics that are interesting to you, just reach out and let us know. So again, my name is Jeff Lundgren. Appreciate your time and look forward to meeting many of you.
Thanks for joining us today on Mormon Mental Health Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please help us and become a monthly subscriber at mormonmentalhealth.org. The goals of this podcast include education, advocacy, and the mental health and general well-being of Mormons and their families. We can't further this work without your support. Music for this episode was provided by the Lower Lights.
Over life's tempestuous sea, chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Unknown ways before me roll, hiding rock and treacherous show. Chart and compass came from thee. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. As a mother stills her child, thou canst touch the ocean wild, wondrous sovereign of the sea. Jesus, Savior, pilot me. Boisterous wave, obey thy will, when thou sayest to them, be still. Wondrous sovereign of the sea, Jesus, Savior, pilot me. When at last I near the shore, and the fearful breakers roar, may I hear twixt me and the peaceful rest, then while leaning on my breast, may I hear thee say to me, fear not.